it's very powerful. And depending on the culture that you grow up in, it's even more powerful. Like I have a lot of Middle Eastern clients. Oh my God, it's like walking into the middle of tribes. You know, there's no such thing as an individual. Everybody's stuck together like melted chocolates, you know, and there's nobody is a separate being. Everybody's who they are because of 50,000 people behind them. And, you know, me trying to figure out what is the passion of this one individual, I often think I'm in the shovel business. You know, I'm constantly shoveling out all of the family around them so that I can separate them out so they know who they are. Okay, so the first day I asked a client, I said, I want you to write your autobiography. And he went back on the couch in my office. What? What has that got to do with my career? I said, I don't know yet. Just write it. Unfortunately, I always had clients who were willing to go along with me and be good guinea pigs. And I was very lucky. I mean, I have been very lucky in my career, no doubt about it. And my best luck has come to me through the people who come to me for help. I often think that somehow or another I'm emitting signals that are attracting them because they're exactly what I need to write. Right? It's called material. Anyway, so the first guy who writes his autobiography and then he brings it back in and I thought, oh my God, now I know what it is that's affecting all these people. This is so complex that I'm not even sure I can solve it. And I knew I was on to what I was born to do. That it was complex enough for my mind to be challenged. Because that was what was the matter with my career. I mean, I can help people get a job. I can help them write a resume. I can show them how to interview. I was a journalist. I know how you go in and you meet people and you get to the power source. But you know, that was boring. It wasn't until I waded in to the family waters, to the story, that I began to understand what was holding my client back. And what it got down to were the 6 basic fears. The number one fear that's in every single family and every single culture is the fear of poverty. The fear of poverty is not necessarily poverty itself. In other words, I have a client who has $200,000 in cash, and all he ever worries about is losing it. I said, you know what? You're going to have to put that $200,000 somewhere where you can't touch it, or we're never going to get anywhere. And he just panicked. He said, what do you mean? I can't touch it. He says, how am I going to get by? I said, you're already making a living. You don't need the $200,000. So who in the world would have thought the $200,000 was his career problem? Well, this went back to his grandparents in the Depression, that he was still behaving as if it was 1936. So the fear of poverty is not necessarily connected with how much money you have. It's the fear of losing what you have, of being out on the street, you know, pushing the grocery cart. So what's going to trigger that fear more than anything is the moment you think about doing what you love for a living. Right? It's like Barbara said, when I first started, there was no connection between passion and work. Passion was for the lucky few. So my client, my $200,000 client, I call him, he finally did partially what I suggested. He went to a financial planner I recommended that he go to so he could park the money where he'd have to leave it long enough. You know, just all imagination, right? I mean, he could have the money any moment he wanted it, but I had to set it up so that he felt like he didn't have it. Why? Because the creative self only reacts when there's danger. My most difficult clients are people who have big trust funds. Why? Because the creative self says, well, you know, why should I exert myself? There's money there. I don't have to do it. But when there's danger, that's when the creative self will come forward. And that's why the recession or difficult economic times are actually very good for creativity. Because it forces something that doesn't come up to the surface during more comfortable times. And you know that in your own life. That the times in your life when you were comfortable, which is the ideal middle class life, you know, nothing ever happens, is when nothing happens. But it feels secure and it feels safe. And yet in your most difficult times, in your scariest times, in your most poverty-stricken times, you look back on that and that was the most exciting period of your life, right? That's when you grew the most. That's when you knew. So I had to set it up to scare my clients enough that it would bring forward this part of their being that I was not having access to, which was their individual self, which really starts to show up around 39 years old. Until you're 39, it kind of sleeps and it waits until you're mature enough that you can actually handle what it really wants to do. And that's why 39 to 43, if you think back in your life, what was going on when you were 39? Didn't you feel restless? Didn't you feel like, oh, why am I here? Up until about 43. That's the period right there where if you don't do it, if you don't get it started, you're going to have to wait another 7 years. And then if you don't do it then, 7 years later, it's going to happen. So that's the way that I've watched over 34 years of working with people now. I can track it. If you really start getting on top of the restlessness that's going on when you're 39, by the time you're 45, 48, 49, you're in your groove. You're doing your passion. You're doing what you're here to do. You may not be making all the money, but you've got all the money you need. And because you're happy, because you're content, you don't really have to spend a lot of money, and so you live fairly modestly, and therefore you just keep accumulating money. And that's how the rich get rich. That's how you get rich, is that you find the emotional security. You find out what it is that gives you that emotional richness. Money is not that important. But the way most people do it, and I put a study about this in the first book, Work with Passion, they do it the opposite. They try to figure out, how can I make enough money so that I can go do what I want to do? That's why people get involved in all the get-rich-quick schemes, right? That's why we're in the economic mess we're in. Because everybody's trying to get the security so they can go do what they want to do, and actually the reverse is true. You've got to do what you really want to do at any age. You've got to do what you want to do at any age. But that doesn't just what you want to do, it's also what you're talented to do. So if you want to be a singer and you can't stay on key, likelihood you're not going to make it. I had one client, he was a guitar player, avocation. And I said to him, well, I don't know, are you any good? Can you play? I mean, I'm not a professional guitar player. And he says, well, I think so. I said, have you ever gone to a professional guitar player and had your work critiqued? He said, no, I haven't. I said, well, how are you going to know if you're any good? Well, he was terrified, actually, to have somebody look at his work, right? So I had a contact who had a contact with the San Francisco Symphony. And so he went and I said, you're going to have to pay this guy for his time. But listen, it's going to be worth it because you got to get this guitar thing in or out. You can't be hanging on all your life, I should have been a guitar player. That's the victim role. So he goes and he has a meeting, he pays the guy, and the guy listens to him. And he told him the truth. He says, actually, you're fairly good, but you're never going to be good enough to make money at it. It's not really what you ought to be doing. But I think it's a wonderful hobby for you. And he was, of course, totally crushed. I said, well, go to one more person. Don't just stop with one critic. That's always my advice, is to try another one and see, it's like having a second opinion in a medical situation. So he went to another person who was more of a jazz guitarist and more of a pop kind of guitarist. I thought, well, maybe he's a pop guitarist. And he told him the same thing. So I said, oh, good. Now we can find out what you're really gifted to do. So in the autobiography of my first client was when I began to see the fears, the 6 fears, the fear of poverty, the second and the most prevalent fear, the fear of criticism. What are they going to think if I do X? The fear of criticism can absolutely stop people in the tracks. Like when I first came out with Work with Passion, one of the interviews that was done of me on this major radio station, there was a man, now this was before cell phones. They had to call in, and so the guy called in to the radio show and he said, I had to drive off the freeway and find a phone booth to call and tell you, how dare you be saying what you're saying to people. I have a mortgage. I have 3 kids. How in the world am I going to do? It's awful what you're saying. You should be ashamed of yourself. I just was quiet for a minute and I said, wow, I guess there's no hope for you. And he hung up. So then we went to the commercial break right away, and the guy says to me, my God, I had no idea this topic was going to stir up so much hostility. He said, it seems perfectly logical to me. I said, well, that's because you like your work. But you have no idea how many people hate their work, and now I'm telling them they have an option. Now they hate me. And everywhere I went, when the book first came out, there would always be somebody, and I began to get to the point where I prayed there would be somebody in there, because, you know, everybody in the audience was thinking the same thing, but not saying it. That I'm just puffing smoke. One man said it even more crudely. And so I got to the point where I brought it up the very first thing in every presentation, because I knew if I didn't get that up to the surface, and that's what I advise all of you who are counselors and you're working with people, do not assume that they're not terrified. Especially do not assume that they're not terrified of working with passion. Because if you pull that off, if you're working with passion and you're making all the money you need, you're going to make some people mad as you know what. And those are going to be the people that are the closest to you. I deal with that all the time with my clients. It's the wives, the girlfriends, the boyfriends, the mothers, the fathers. It's